All right, I think we are at the hour, so we're gonna get started. So hello everyone, thank you so much for joining today's session. Happy Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, as well as Jewish American Heritage Month, and for our Canadian colleagues, Asian Heritage Month and Jewish Heritage Month in Canada. So my name is Ray Pan, pronouns are he and him, and I am delighted to have you all here for this session, focusing on Bernardine Shanghai Salon, the story of Doyenne of Old China. We are so excited to have our author here who will introduce shortly. I am this year's CALA, the Chinese American Librarians Association president, and I am delighted to be hosting with AJL president, Michelle Margolis. Michelle, do you want to say hi?
Sure, I'm thrilled that we could join with you, and really thank you to Ray for bringing us in on this. We're really excited to be joining you in this great presentation.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle. And with that being said, I also want to share that if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop in the chat box that will go to me or Michelle, and we'll be happy to share it to Susan, or I think Susan also could get the responses too directly. And so with that being said, we are going to transition to the next slide. I wanted to just share briefly here about CALA, the Chinese American Librarians Association, which is in co-partnership with AJL for this webinar. Since 1973, CALA has supported a community of Chinese and Chinese American librarians, educators, researchers, and scholars. We're keenly interested in the professional development and research of CALA members. In essence, we are a nonprofit, volunteer library-run membership association. We have over 500 members across the United States, Canada, and Asia Pacific regions. In addition, for those who would like to learn more, cala-web.org, we offer biannual newsletters, webinar series like this one, leadership development program, travel awards, research grants, research programs, and in support of so many folks doing important work, especially focusing on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So all individuals and institutions are welcome to join CALA. We really welcome advocates and allies to partner with us. And this coming year, we are excited to be celebrating our 50th anniversary. It's really an exciting time here. And now I'll pass it over to the Association of Jewish Library President, Michelle Margolis, for opening remarks.
Thanks, Ray. The Association of Jewish Libraries was founded in 1966 as actually part of a merger of two earlier organizations, the Jewish Librarians Association, which was founded in 1946, and the Jewish Library Association founded in 1962. We are an international professional organization that fosters access to information and research in all forms of media relating to all things Jewish. The association promotes Jewish literacy and scholarship and provides a community for peer support and professional development. The association is made up of two divisions. We have a research archives and special libraries division, as well as a school, synagogue, center, and public libraries division. And you can find more information about AJL at jewishlibraries.org. I know a lot of people are gearing up for ALA. The week before ALA, we're having our annual conference. This year is a virtual conference. We alternate virtual and in-person conferences every year. So that's happening the week before. So feel free to take a look at our website to find out more about the Association of Jewish Libraries. And thanks again, Ray, for including us in this wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you, Michelle, and for dropping the links there. You can see it in the chat box. And now we're going to proceed here to introduce our program and our speaker. We're really excited to have both organizations come together to support this webinar featuring Susan Blumberg-Kason. And so Susan is the author of Good Chinese Wife, A Love Affair with China Gone Wrong, and co-editor of Hong Kong Noir. She is a regular contributor to the Asian Review of Books, Cha, an Asian Literary Journal, and Undomesticated. Her work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, World Literature Today, Pop Matters, and the South China Morning Post. She received a Master's of Philosophy in Government and Public Administration public administration from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she researched provincial assemblies in the late Qing dynasty. Born, raised, and now based in Chicago suburbs, Susan is finalizing her biography of Bernardine Szold Fritz. She is represented by Alicia Brooks at JVNLA. So please join me in welcoming Susan. And thank you, Susan. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ray, and for inviting me in the first place. And thank you, Michelle, for co-hosting. I'm really excited to be here today to speak about Bernardine Szold Fritz. And I am going to share my screen now. I want to just thank also Bernardine's family for being here today, because this is such a treat to have you here, and I couldn't have done this without you. Before we get to 1930 Shanghai and the art scene there, I want to go back 3 decades before that to the turn of the previous century in Peoria, Illinois, because this is where Bernardine was born to Hungarian Jewish immigrants. And she and her 3 siblings all showed an early interest in the theater. They produced plays and skits at home, and all 4 of the Szold siblings went into either acting or directing or both. And Bernardine's acting career started early. As still in her late teens, she acted at the Chicago Little Theater. And this was a really big deal. The Chicago Little Theater was the first of its kind, and it inspired other little theaters around the US, but also in London and Berlin. It was the first theater in the US to produce plays by George Bernard Shaw and Henrik Ibsen. It treated puppetry as an art form. No one else had done that before. The Little Theater was based in the Fine Arts Building of Chicago. And it was such a great time because Frank Lloyd Wright had an office there. Hemingway started out writing poetry there. And there was a Little Review, which was a journal that started after the Little Theater. And the actors there didn't just learn to act, but they also learned set design and stage makeup and lighting and costume making. And it was such a great experience for someone in her late teens and early 20s. But unfortunately for everybody at the Chicago Little Theater, they were without a job in 1917 because of the Great War, or World War I, as we would call it now. The theater closed, but the others around the country stayed open, or they were open after that. So Bernardine was resourceful, and she switched gears. She became a journalist, completely self-educated. She never went to college, so she didn't study journalism formally, but she got a job with the Chicago Evening Post. And she supposedly was the first female political reporter in Chicago. She wrote for them for a couple of years, and then she moved to New York, where she wrote for the New York Daily News. Now, this is not a photo of her. I just found this image for the masthead. During this time in Chicago and New York, Bernardine married and divorced 3 times. So this is her in New York in 1925 with her daughter, Rosemary. Rosemary was her only child and was from her first marriage. The week that her divorce went through in 1925, the 3rd one, she took Rosemary and moved to Paris. Now, in Paris in 1925, it was the height of what Gertrude Stein called the lost generation. And Bernardine became a part of that. She enrolled Rosemary in a boarding school in Switzerland run by a protege of Isadora Duncan. Bernardine was friends with Isadora Duncan. She also reunited with friends from Chicago like Ernest Hemingway, and friends from New York like Zeldin F. Scott Fitzgerald, among many others. She attended Gertrude Stein's salon, and she also wrote. So there was a new magazine at that time in 1925 called The New Yorker. She knew the founders from her time in New York, and she wrote in July of 1925 this from Paris. It was a letter from Paris, and she wrote about the Ballet Russe. Right after this, a woman named Janet Flanner, who was a friend of hers, started writing letters from Paris for The New Yorker too. And Janet Flanner went on for decades to write the letter from Paris and also had books centered around her letters. But Bernardine wrote a couple of these for The New Yorker. She also wrote for Arts and Decoration. And she was employed by the Tribune News Service. But after a while, her writing career kind of fizzled out. She started a novel that was never published. No one knows what happened to it. And then she decided to enroll as an out student at Cambridge, which is what we'd call a continuing education student, to study literature. And she writes more about anti-Semitism in the UK than she does about what she studied. So after, she'd been in Europe for a couple of years, she kind of felt like she was in limbo. Rosemary was still in boarding school in Switzerland. She suddenly had this opportunity she could not pass up. An American friend in Paris named Barbara Harrison, who was an heiress and had more money than she knew what to do with, invited Bernardine to go on a trip with her halfway around the world. Now, there was a man involved because Barbara was traveling with a foreign correspondent named Walter Harris, who was 4 decades older than her. And it wasn't socially acceptable for the two of them to travel together without a chaperone. And Bernardine, being around Barbara's age, was that chaperone. So the two women and Walter set sail. They went through the Middle East, through parts of Asia. And then when they got to Singapore, Barbara and Bernardine ditched Walter and hightailed it to Saigon. After they had been on the road for about a year, they get to Shanghai. And it's there that they meet a silver broker from North Dakota named Chester Fritz. Chester had been in China for about 15 years. He came out to Asia to work in Hong Kong and then became this precious metals expert. He was never married. He was 4 years older than Bernardine, and he enjoyed her stories about Paris and Chicago and New York. He laughed at her jokes, and she was flattered. She liked the attention. What stood out to her about Chester was that he was the only foreigner that she met in Shanghai that had Chinese friends. But she and Barbara met a lot of different characters on their trips. They left Shanghai after a few weeks, went up to Peking or Beijing, and then they set back to Europe on the Trans-Siberian, going through the Soviet Union. It was still pretty new at the time. And they didn't think about Chester at all. Now, when Bernardine gets back to Paris, this is her in 1929, she finds telegram after telegram after telegram from Chester Fritz, and he's begging her to return to Shanghai to marry him. He has never met anyone like her. He can't stop thinking about her, and he promises her a comfortable and adventurous life. And at first she thinks, he's just joking. It's some type of infatuation, but the telegrams keep arriving. And she starts to talk to her friends about it, especially Barbara Harrison, who had met Chester in Shanghai. And the friends start to think that maybe this is something Bernardine should consider. A lot of them are moving to the south of France. This is before the stock market crash in New York in late 1929, so it's early 1929. And some are moving to New York. So Bernardine doesn't have a writing job. Rosemary's still at her boarding school, and her friends are leaving. So I think it's that, plus her sense of adventure and that she was a romantic, that she said yes to Chester. So instead of meeting in Shanghai, he tells her he'll meet her in Manchuria, which is the northeast part of China. So they meet in a city called Doyenne. It's today's Dalian. Doyenne is the Japanese name for Dalian, and it was a Japanese concession. There were lots of foreign concessions all over China, including 2 in Shanghai. The International Settlement, which at that time was run by representatives from 14 countries, and there was also the French concession. So they meet in Doyenne, and I like this photo because I feel like it symbolizes their marriage. Bernardine is happy. Her eyes are glowing. She's smiling. She's posing. She looks confident. And Chester looks like he doesn't want to be there. I can't tell if he's trying to smile or if he's just downright frowning. So this is what happens. He's not the person he advertises himself to be. And her first 2 years in Shanghai are miserable. It's hard to meet friends. Chester's whole community is around the business world. Bernardine has no interest in that. She's used to being in these artsy communities and ones that are really at the peak of their time. And so it's hard. And she wants to meet Chinese friends. But Chester's Chinese friends are all involved in business, and the foreigners, they're not interested in the arts. They just want to sit around and drink and play cards all day and gossip, and she doesn't know who they're speaking about. So it's very difficult. Things will change, though. After 2 years of of all people in the world, Chester, introduces her to Hu Shi. He's the gentleman on the left, and he is like the reformer in China. He reforms education. He wants people to be able to read. So he changes, he promotes this new vernacular style of writing. And he feels that if people can become educated and they have to read first, then they can lead a better, more fulfilling life. Hu Shi and Bernardine write to each other through the 1960s. So this is typical of her friendships, especially in China. She writes to her friends and they to her for decades after they meet. So it's not just a superficial friendship or something that, you know, is fleeting. It's deep and it's intellectual. She loves to talk about the arts with these friends. So Hu Shi introduces Bernardine to the gentleman on the right, who is Lin Yutang. He is one of the most celebrated writers in China, but he's also a bestseller in the US because he writes in both English and in Chinese. And his wife, Hong, is also a writer in English. And she and Bernardine and Lin Yutang become very close friends. Lin Yutang and Bernardine write to each other for decades, but it's really Hong and Bernardine who write through the 1970s to each other. But while they're in Shanghai, this is like 1931, they introduced Bernardine to other artists, including writers and musicians and actors. And Bernardine suddenly is in this community that she had dreamed of when she first accepted Chester's proposal. So to give back or to contribute to the community, she starts a salon in her home. And it'd be easy to attribute this to Gertrude Stein, which is true. Bernardine did attend Gertrude Stein's salon, but this was something that Jewish women had been doing since the late 1700s. It was a way to bring other marginalized people together, to kind of mainstream, and to talk about the arts or philosophy, but through discussions. And Bernardine's home was massive. I went to this building in 2019 and it was being refurbished. So I just walked into a unit and they're all pretty similar in size. And I got lost. I went from room to room to room to room. And when I got to the end, I didn't really know how to get back to the front. So it was really easy to get lost and it was big. But she kept the salon to 2 rooms because unlike a cocktail party where people can have these smaller conversations and they mingle and they go from like group to group, the salon was more of a discussion, and it could be in a couple of rooms, but sometimes Bernardine would invite someone to play the erhu, which is a 2-stringed instrument, or to give a poetry reading. And if you didn't have a way to discuss where people could actually hear, it would kind of defeat the purpose. And the problem with her salon was that it became popular really fast. So she would get up to 150 people a night, a couple times a week. So to give more people access to these discussions, she started the International Arts Theater, or what was called the IAT. And this was modeled after the Chicago Little Theater. So she planned not only to have plays produced there, but she had ballet, lectures, debates, and also classes like she had taken in set design and stage makeup and lighting and puppetry. And so there are so many things I could talk about with the IAT. They did a lot of different programs, but I picked 2 that relate to problems we still have today. So I felt like that's, you know, pretty relatable, and they're different in scope and what it took to produce them. So the first lecture that she had as part of the IAT that was not at her home, but was at the IAT studio, was a lecture by a German Jewish refugee named Max Mohr. He was one of the early Jewish refugees to come to Shanghai. And we can talk about this more in the questions later, but Shanghai eventually had about 24,000 Jewish refugees from Europe because it was the only big city in the world that would allow Jews to enter without what we would call papers. So the Dominican Republic was also one of them, but that was harder to get to. And Shanghai was like the 4th biggest city in the world then. So at this time in 1935, Max Mohr was one of the early Jews to find refuge in Shanghai. Most wouldn't arrive until 1938 or 1939. So Bernardine, you know, this was not on her radar. Most people could not have ever imagined what would happen in the years to come. But Bernardine was interested in Mohr because he was a good friend of the late author D.H. Lawrence. Lawrence had died in 1930, but in the late 20s, Max More and Lawrence traveled around together. They bonded over the field of psychoanalysis, and More was also an author. He wrote in German. So Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned in England, the UK, India, Japan. It was printed in Italy and a little bit in France, I think. But Lawrence was known for this book, and it was banned, and Max More had a copy of the manuscript. So Bernardine thought it would be a great way to get people engaged around this topic of banned books and to really understand who Lawrence was as a writer and as a person. And Max More was a great person to do that. So he was more than willing to talk about his friendship and the writer Lawrence and the book. And Bernardine was right, because the audience loved it. They thought they had this insider's look at this author, and there was a great discussion afterwards. So it not only provided the audience in Shanghai with this great lecture, but it gave the IAT more momentum to do more. This was in around March of 1935. Bernardine had some other programs, but in the middle of 1935, she set out on her greatest endeavor yet, and that was to produce this play, Lady Precious Stream. Now, there's been a bunch of books written about Lady Precious Stream and the playwright Shuri Xiong. So I'll just give a little background on that because it's so fascinating. Shuri Xiong was a translator and a playwright and an intellectual in China, and he and his wife Daimia, who's also a writer and she wrote in English, moved to England in 1932 because it was Shuri Xiong's dream to be produced on the West End. And he loved British literature. So he talked to some people in the theater scene there, and they were pretty welcoming, but they told him he would never succeed if he wrote a play set in England. So they advised him to write a Chinese play that had never been done on the West End. And just to get his foot in the door, he decided to do that. So he picked a Peking opera, which was normally 7 hours long, called Wang Baochuan, which means Lady Precious Stream in Chinese, and he condensed it into 2 hours, into a 4-act play. The premise of the play was not unlike Lady Chatterley's Lover. It was about an aristocratic woman who falls in love with a beggar. They get married against the family's will, and then he gets drafted into the army, goes away for 18 years. And when he's away, he falls in love with the princess of the Western region, and they marry. So now he's got 2 wives. After 18 years, he returns to his first wife, Lady Precious Stream, with his second wife. And now this former beggar has these 2 fancy wives. And Shuri Xiong knew that this would probably not go down well with the British audiences. So he kind of watered it down. The beggar became the family gardener, so he had a job. And the husband never married Princess of the Western region. He just had this romantic relationship with her. So when they returned to Lady Precious Stream, it wasn't a polygamous situation. It was just another woman. So this went on for 1,000 nights on the West End. It was the first Chinese play. It was all in English, and 4 future prime ministers attended it. And London had never seen anything like this. Now, the problem with it was that every single actor was dressed in yellowface. They were all white, and it would be easy and not accurate to say that the London theater scene could not find actors who are Chinese or of Chinese descent, but that's wrong. I am not I'm not an expert on theater, and I could come up with a cast of 4 main characters who are Chinese or Chinese American or Chinese Australian. So, and who could have done this? So it was just that was what producers thought the audience wanted, but Bernardine knew better, and she was going to do it the right way. So she wrote to Shuri Xiong in early 1935, asked if she could produce the play, and he gave her his blessing, but he wasn't going to go to Shanghai for 2 nights of a performance. So Bernardine's production, and she had a full production crew. She was just, on the sides helping, but she had directors, one of which was her sister, but she also had a Chinese director. They picked an actress named Tang Ying to be Lady Precious Stream. And the way that this play was written about afterwards, it was as if Shuri Xiong had written that role for Tang Ying especially. She was great. She just wowed the audiences. And the counterpart, the now Gardner, was played by a man named Henry Lin. He studied at USC, and a decade after the play was produced in Shanghai, he became a university president in Shanghai. So he was an amateur, but he was pretty prominent in the community. Lady Silverstream, who was Lady Precious Stream's sister, was played by a woman named Daisy Kwok. She was a friend of Bernardine and was an overseas Chinese from Australia who came back to Shanghai with her family because they ran the Wing On department stores there and in Hong Kong. This is the audience, and it's kind of hard to see because this photo is almost 100 years old, but in the foreground is Victor Sassoon. He's a Baghdadi Jewish real estate mogul who's responsible for a lot of the old architecture in Shanghai that's still there. The audience was mixed. There were foreigners, there were Chinese, and people loved it. There were so many requests for more tickets after the first 2 nights sold out that Bernardine arranged a 3rd night, but had to find another theater because the Carlton where this was produced didn't have room after that. And the set design was amazing. Every single actor was Chinese, but also the costumes were authentic. They were made by people who did this as their job. The headdress, this is Princess of the Western Region, and the makeup. The stage design was simple. It was just like a drawing room, but the furniture was real, and the audience they could not stop talking about this. So I've looked, and Lady Precious Stream it's seen revivals around, throughout the years, and the last time it was produced was last year in Sydney in 2022. So there's a lot more to talk about with Bernardine. Just to give you an idea of like what happened to the IAT. It closed in 1937. The Japanese military bombed Shanghai in August of 1937, but right before that, Bernardine's daughter, Rosemary, was in New York, and she was acting and became sick. So it was the first time that Chester encouraged a relationship between Bernardine and Rosemary, and he kind of encouraged her to go to New York and take care of her daughter. And then war would break out, and it wasn't just one war, it was World War II, and then the Civil War after that. So Bernardine never returned to Shanghai. She and Chester eventually divorced. She settled in Hollywood, and she had a salon there, and the people that attended it were Henry Miller and Aldous Huxley. And, she had this like community in Hollywood, but it was never like Shanghai. And that was always her, she writes, and her family says that it was like her most favorite time of her life. So I want to talk, have questions. And I think that's like the best part of all of this. So I will end here and take questions.
Great presentation, Susan. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for just sharing the experiences that you've went through yourself, but also like what the story is. So really appreciate that. Yes, as Michelle said in the chat box, if you have any questions, please feel free to direct them via chat and we will be able to share them.
I do see one about Pearl Buck. So yes, she did know Pearl Buck. There is a letter between them. I don't know how close they were. I don't think it was very close, but they had a lot of mutual friends. And sometimes they would poke fun of her. So Lin Yutong's, he had a book in 1936 that was a bestseller in New York, and he dedicates it to Bernardine, to Pearl Buck, and then this other baroness who was part of Bernardine's circle. So, so yeah. One of the things about Lin Yutong is that Bernardine always stood up for him, but some of the intellectuals in Shanghai at the time didn't think Lin Yutong should represent Chinese writers because he had spent time in the US and in Europe. And Bernardine thought that was ridiculous. She said Lin Yutong was perfect to do that. He could cross cultures. And she thought if Pearl Buck could be the face of China in the US, why couldn't Lin Yutong too? So that says it all, I think.
I was curious,
Yeah.
Susan, if I may, sorry, moderator's
yeah.
privilege, I guess. Just to learn a little bit about how you got into this research, what brought you to this?
So that kind of, I saw the question about Emily Han, that kind of goes into it. So I had first gone to Shanghai in 1988 when I was in high school, and then in 91 in college. And I noticed at that time, I mean, it was a big city, but it was still had this like kind of sleepy feel. When I went back in 95 to do research with my then husband, my first one, there was something different. And in bookstores and in movie theaters, I saw images and movies about 1930s Shanghai, and it was starting to come back, and they were celebrating it for the first time. So I was really interested in it. And then I learned there was this whole Jewish angle. Not only were there refugees there, but there was a Baghdadi Jewish community. There was a Russian Jewish community, which I write about in the book too. And so I read Emily Han's China to Me, and page 5, Bernardine appears. And then my mom buys a book by Vicky Baum, who was an Austrian Jewish writer who wrote this book called Shanghai 37. And it was about the bombing in 1937. And it takes place in like a cafe hotel type of building. That's Victor Sassoon owned this beautiful hotel called the Cafe Hotel. And it's now the Peace Hotel. It's still there. And it's like the most fabulous place in Shanghai. So it's a fictional account of this bombing. And Vicky Baum was a friend of Bernardine, and Emily Han was a friend of hers from the US. And she introduced Emily Han to Victor Sassoon and to Xin Mei Zhao, who was a Chinese poet. And so in the mid 90s and early 2000s, I started learning a lot about this part of Shanghai, and Bernardine's name would keep coming up, but it wasn't always in like great terms. And I think over the years, some writers have kind of picked up, they thought that she was like this socialite or kind of a fluffy person. And I wanted to know more. And then when I found out she was from Illinois, and I'm from Illinois, that's kind of how, and she was nothing like what she's been portrayed as. So.
Yeah, I got a few questions here, if I may ask. One person wanted to know, any connection with Somerset Maugham?
Yeah, so Somerset Maugham was in the south of France when Bernardine was going there, when she lived in Paris. Her friend Barbara Harrison, who took her to Asia in the first place, had a home in the south of France. And so Jean Cocteau was one of their friends. Somerset Maugham was kind of on the periphery, but she did know him. I mean, they weren't great friends or anything, but that was just all part of that community.
Michelle, do you have any questions? Okay, so I have another one. I'm curious if this book is a historical fiction or biography, or maybe it's blended with personal memoir. Can you talk about the form and structure a bit, please?
Okay, so it is a biography, a traditional biography. It's nonfiction. When I started researching it, I didn't think I was going to get enough information to do a full biography. So one of my, I had an independent editor that I worked with. He told me to weave in the research part of it. It's kind of like the Henrietta Lacks biography that Rebecca Skloot kind of wove in how she found out. So I'd had that in the beginning. And then it just became really big because I got a ton of information from Bernardine's family. I mean, hundreds of her writings, and the Yale archives had a lot of her letters and letters to her. So in the end, my agent and my publisher felt like it should just be more focused on Bernardine. So I did take out, I had to, because of time, I didn't have like a lot of space that they wanted to keep it shorter rather than longer. So I took out the personal part of it, but I do have some footnotes about conversations with her family and things like that.
Yeah, that actually brings me to another question I wanted to ask related to follow-ups, but I want to ask you, Susan, if there are any questions you've been receiving that you want to address before we.
So Emily Han, she was definitely connected with, she was friends with her. Bernardine's great niece wrote, if there are letters with her siblings at the time, there were. And she asked about Bernardine's youngest sister visiting her. So that's really, that's in the book too. There were letters from some siblings, but not a lot. Bernardine and Chester traveled out of Shanghai most of 1934, and they went through Asia and Europe, and they went back to the US. And at that time, Bernardine's younger sister, Aline, was recovering from tuberculosis. And I tried to look into see, like, how do you recover from this? And there's really no way to do it. You don't have to be in a certain climate. You just need rest. So Bernardine convinced their parents that the sister Aline should go back with her to Shanghai. And so she did. And instead of like giving Aline rest, she roped her into the IAT, and she was co-director of Lady Precious Stream. But they found a Chinese director who he worked for a petroleum company during the day, but his like background was in Chinese theater. So it was perfect. And Aline was kind of like an assistant, and her like personality was very calm. And so she worked well with this S.Y. Wong. So yeah, she was there for the good part of a year. And Chester hated it. He did not want anyone in Bernardine's family to be around her, even though he ignored her himself. So it's, you know.
I did get a question. Have you thought about writing another book or an article about the research journey? Because it sounds like that was, not as fascinating as the book, but almost.
Yeah, like I would love to, because it was fun. It took me to Beverly Hills. I'd never been in LA before. And Bernardine's cousin, Nancy, who's here, opened her doors and gave me so many papers and photos. And then we both went on a day trip later that week to visit Bernardine's cousin, David, who's on here too, in the East Bay of the San Francisco area. And again, more papers and I found this, we found this poem that Bernardine's second husband had written to her. So I include that in the book. And then 2 months after that, my older son was studying abroad in Shanghai, and he was at NYU Shanghai. And he became involved in this orchestra, and they had one performance in May of 2019. And it was a splurge, but I went for like a long weekend with my 9-year-old and my mom. And we went to see this one performance, but we went to Bernardine's building. And that's when we walked in, and it was being refurbished. And there's a little museum on the ground floor about that area of Shanghai in the 30s. And there's a little poster of Bernardine and Chester and what she did. And one of the units in that building has been turned into a salon space to kind of commemorate that time in Shanghai. So yeah, the research, I would love to do that. I would love to write about that. So I hope there's an opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. There's another question here. You have so many amazing experiences and connections. What was the biggest challenge in tying them all together in the book?
Oh gosh. Well, I thought I wasn't going to have enough information. I think in the end, there were so many characters because she knew so many people. So to put them all together and not to like drive the reader crazy. So she knew Emily Hahn, and then she had a salon and she invited her. And then Emily Hahn met Victor Sassoon, and then met Sin Mei Zhao, who was a poet and a writer and a publisher. And so there's them, and then there's Lin Yutang and all of like his circle. There was a contemporary of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo named Miguel Covarrubias, and his wife Rosa Rolanda. And Miguel was an illustrator for the New Yorker and Vanity Fair. And so he came to Shanghai twice, once in 1930 and once in 1933. And Bernardine hosted him the second time for a month with his wife. And so I write about them and the illustrators that Bernardine introduced to them that were Chinese counterparts, and they both used elements from each other's work after that. So just to show what happened after these connections, but there's all these characters, and to kind of make that make sense. So I think that was challenging. So my editor asked for a list of characters at the end of the book. So it's there in case people get confused.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like a lot of a cast of characters in
Yes. Mhm.
biography that you're writing. A question is, I recall seeing this on social media. It's coming out in the fall. Is that right?
Yes, November 7th. Yeah. Mhm.
November 7th. So at this time, I think we're gonna also announce that 61 of you are still here. We're gonna drop a link where you can actually, we're giving out a raffle. So if you want to participate in this raffle, we're so thankful that Susan and the publisher are willing to offer 2 copies. So we're gonna do a drawing later, and then we'll be in touch and we'll send you the copies when it's ready. Is that right, Susan?
Mhm. Yes, yes.
So any other questions, Michelle or Susan, that you're seeing?
Yeah, I see one from Bernardine's cousin David. So he asked if Bernardine ever wrote about social and political issues. She did. It was more in her letters to friends at back home and in her vignettes. She was frustrated when people that she met in Shanghai didn't care about politics, because this was in the early 30s and the mid 30s. There was the Civil War was going on, the nationalists and the communists. And there was, and then the Japanese were also like making inroads. They bombed Shanghai in 1932 when she was there, and then again in 1937 when she wasn't there. So there was a lot going on. It was not the most safe city in the world. When someone had a political rival, it wasn't unusual to have that person assassinated. There was a lot of disease, and there was a huge like income disparity or wealth disparity. So she wrote about that to friends. And when she got back to the US in the late 30s, she would host fundraisers for China Relief. So to raise money for the Chinese government while they were fighting in World War II against the Japanese. So yeah, she was, it wasn't really in a formal way though. And then I also saw a question from another relative, Dory. Did she ever live in Switzerland in a chalet that Chester Fritz bought? I don't think so. So Chester married another single mom after he and Bernardine divorced. And he tried to like ignore that new stepdaughter, but the joke was on him. And they did end up in Switzerland, and they settled there. Chester died 2 decades before his second wife did. And then when his second wife died, his stepdaughter that he didn't like, the second one, inherited everything. So he did give $1 million to the University of North Dakota Library and another $1 million to the University of North Dakota Auditorium. So if anyone's ever in Great Forks, I think, there's the Chester Fritz Library and the Chester Fritz Auditorium. So yeah, but Bernardine didn't live in Switzerland.
Thanks for sharing. There's a question here. Can you touch on the time Bernardine met Anna May Wong in Shanghai?
Oh, yes. So that's one of my favorite parts of the book. So Bernardine met Anna May in London in 1934 when she was on this like grand trip back to the US, the long way, and didn't really think much of her. Like they didn't connect or whatever. And then Anna May was, she was not cast for the Great Earth or the Good Earth. And it was a 1936 production, and she auditioned in 1935, I believe. So she was upset about that. She was offered this, like the most like the evil role in that movie. So she didn't take it. And she had just been disappointed by Hollywood over and over. So she decided to make a movie, a documentary in China, and she had never been to China before. So she went there, and she didn't meet Bernardine right away, but they eventually met. And Bernardine and Anna May became very close. And Bernardine gave her letters of introduction for people in Tianjin and Beijing, or Tianjin and Peking at the time. And so Anna May became part of this, this artist world in China for the time that she was there. And she and Bernardine wrote to each other a lot. Bernardine had this habit of like roping in her friends to like be surrogate parents of Rosemary. So when Anna May went back to New York in the late 30s, I have letters that show that Anna May is like helping Rosemary and checking up on her and, trying to like be her mother. And it was hard because that's what, you know, Bernardine wasn't there, and that relationship with her daughter was not good. So she and Anna May met up again in Hollywood in the late 30s and early 40s. And there's a new book about a new biography of Anna May by Katie G. Salisbury, who's on this call, and it's called Not My China Doll, and it's going to be out in early 2024. So we become friends because of the Anna May and Bernardine friendship, and so we've traded letters, and they had a lot of mutual friends. So you know, it's even from Shanghai to New York to Hollywood, it seems like there's a lot of distance, but those arts communities had so much overlap then. So it was a really special time, although like politically it wasn't great. But you know, where was it? So
yeah, thanks for sharing that. So another question I received here. Well, let me ask Michelle, do you have anything you have to ask? Okay. This is a question. What's next for you, Susan?
Oh gosh. Well, the book isn't out yet, so I'm not sure, but I just want to do as much as I can to get this book out. And you know, I don't know. I'm not sure yet, because I started
Taking
this
a breather. That's also allowed.
Yeah, well, I started this in late 2018, so it's been a lot. This got me through like the worst of like the early pandemic, and I haven't like done a lot since then. I saw a question about if Bernardine acted on stage with the IAT, and I never found anything about that. She was kind of behind the scenes a lot. There was her friend Daisy Kwok, who acted as Lady Silverstream, arranged a show one night where Chinese actors, and this wasn't hard, put on a play speaking English, but then native English speaking actors put on a play speaking Chinese. I'm not sure if it was Shanghai Hua or Mandarin, but Daisy was like orchestrating that. So I'm not sure if Bernardine did that. She learned a little Shanghai Hua because I can see in her writings, I don't understand it. And so I just take it, you know, I trust that it's right, but she learned, she would kind of sprinkle in some Shanghai Hua is like the Shanghai dialect. So she sprinkled it a little bit, but she, you know, mostly everyone could speak English, whether it was Russian emigres or people like Max Moore from Germany or Chinese intellectuals. I mean, a lot had studied in the UK or the US. So
yeah, I'm thinking there was a German paper, a German Jewish paper that was produced in China.
There were like 100 different papers in Shanghai at that time. There were Yiddish, German, Russian, Japanese, French. I mean, the French concession was, you know, run by France. And then the international settlement was originally settled by the British and the Americans. And at the time Bernardine was there, 14 different countries had representatives on the municipal council. So there were people from all over. And this hasn't really been proven or talked about, I don't think, but I'm convinced that the Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria and other parts of Eastern Europe had as good of a time there as they could have because there was already an established Jewish community there. Whether it was the Iraqi Jews or the Russian Jews or people like Bernardine and Emily Hahn, because they were Jewish, they were kosher butchers. There were synagogues. There were over half a dozen synagogues. There was a Russian synagogue that's now the Jewish Refugees Museum. There were a number of these Iraqi synagogues that had the women on the balcony, and they're beautiful. And there's one in Hong Kong too, built by the Sassoons. So they had kind of this infrastructure there. They also had people like the Sassoons and the Kadoris who had, the Kadoris had a Jewish school. So a lot of the refugee kids could go to school there. It was in English, but you know, they could go. And there was just kind of this like underlying infrastructure. And I think if that wasn't there, the Jews that went there may not have had as of fulfilling life as they did. And a lot were there for a decade. So
There's a wonderful, I'm thinking of the Leo Beck podcast, Exile. One of the episodes there talked about refugees in Shanghai. They talk about under Japanese occupation, which was
which is
not
terrible.
so great,
No, it was
to say the
absolutely,
least.
it was, so
It
I
was
read
pretty
it.
bad.
No, I read it. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
bad.
yeah, but they have papers relating to during the war, but in the 30s it was a different world.
Right. I read this memoir of an Austrian Jewish man who went to Shanghai, and then his daughter kind of put together his diaries, and she wrote of the 3 like most stressful times of his life: living under Nazi Austria, Germany, moving to Shanghai as a refugee, and living under the Japanese in Shanghai. By far the worst was the 3rd, because they did find a way out of Austria. They knew they were going to be accepted in Shanghai, but they never knew they were going to get out. And the terror that this one sergeant named Goya, he treated the Jews so badly, and it was really awful. So I think that's really telling that, that was bad. So,
Yeah.
but Bernardine wasn't there then. So.
And definitely for those who are not aware, at that time in Shanghai, there was no visa requirement. So that was something that refugees would come in, and of course, we were just talking about what would happen afterwards. And so, yeah, thank you, Michelle, for sharing that podcast there in the link you can see. So any other questions, Susan or Michelle, that you're getting?
Yeah, there was something about Lin Yutang, who wrote The Wisdom of China. Yeah, he wrote, I think, more in English than he did in Chinese. And Lin Yutang eventually, he was caught in New York when Japan bombed China. So that's really when World War II started. Like, people don't really, it was early, it was like 1937. So he and his wife were like stranded in New York City. They eventually go back a little bit, then he settles in Singapore for a while, then in Taiwan, but kind of goes back and forth to New York for a while. And he's buried in Taiwan, and there's a museum there at his house that I've never been to, but I think that would be great. Like, if people read more of Lin Yutang, because he was so central to that time and really talked about both cultures and could see it, he was like a bridger, so that, he bridged people together.
There's a question that just come up here. Who would Susan choose for her dream salon today?
Oh gosh. You mean as someone who would do the salon or to attend? Yikes. I mean, it would be writers. I definitely think it would be authors. I liked the thing about inviting Max Moore because of the band Lady Chatterley's Lover. And I think having a salon about banned books would be great. I think the worst thing you can do when books are banned is just to let that happen and not talk about it or not try to understand. As a host, oh gosh, that is so hard. Maybe Kevin Kwan. I think Kevin Kwan would be good.
Sounds great. All right, it doesn't seem like we have any other questions or comments coming in. So I just wanted to emphasize again, November 7th. Did I get that date right? You said?
Yes, November 7th. Mm-hmm.
November 7th. Be sure to take a look at it. It'd be great for just making these connections. I'm just like, maybe Michelle might agree with me. Right after this call or later today, I'm going to be looking up some of the references and discussions. And so, yeah, thank you folks for filling out the raffling form. So I did want to say, as Susan was answering some questions of going through the raffling form, so thank you. We have Fred and Eileen, so you are the winners. So congratulations. We'll be in touch with the copies that you'll receive later. And any sort of closing remarks, Susan?
No, I just want to thank everyone for being here. And it was such an honor to speak to both library associations, and yeah, thank you for doing this and sharing your love of literature. So it's an honor.
Yes, thank you so much, Susan, for making time to be here. We really appreciate you and your work and how you are making these connections, telling these stories that need to be told. And I also want to leave space here for Michelle if you have any closing remarks.
Just to thank you both. I mean, it's so wonderful, there are so many different things that happen in various months, and the fact that we both have sort of this shared Heritage Month. It's so wonderful that we don't have to be like that. We do have so many things to talk about. Ray and I also talked about, we're watching as newer books are coming out, and there are more Jewish Asian connected books that we're watching. So keep an eye. You might hear from us again. We're looking forward to collaborate more. And so thank you. I'm really looking forward to your book. It sounds fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. And we'll send the recording to everyone here. Thanks so much for making time. We're so excited that we were able to come together as a community to hear Susan and the work you're doing. And again, happy Jewish American Heritage Month and Asian American Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian Heritage Month. And we're looking forward to connecting in the future again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.